The cell was stone and silence. A dripping sound came from somewhere deep within the vaults beneath Edinburgh's old toll booth. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of rot, old iron, and blood long dried. In the corner sat a man whose name few would remember, but whose screams would echo through Scottish history, one of the Covenanters, those who had refused to bend their faith to the king's command. His crime was simple, yet unforgivable in the eyes of the crown. He had signed the national covenant, pledging loyalty to God before any earthly monarch. In the 1670s, that act alone could be a death sentence. The guard outside whispered to another, "He still refuses to speak." The reply came with grim amusement, "Then we'll make his legs do the talking." They dragged him out into the dim chamber, where the instruments of persuasion waited, ropes, chains, racks, and beside them, the object that made even the hardened soldiers turn pale, the boot. It looked deceptively ordinary, to heavy cases of iron, each shaped roughly like a man's leg. Open along one side. Inside, there was room enough for flesh and bone, but not mercy. Beside it lay a basket of wooden wedges, a hammer blackened by use, and a bowl of water to cool the iron after it was heated red-hot in the forge. The man, already trembling, tried to pray. He spoke the psalms through chattering teeth as they forced his legs into the cold metal casing. Chains clamped around his thighs and ankles, pinning him in place. His eyes met those of the judge who watched from a raised platform, calm, distant, a man convinced that faith must be crushed for order to survive. "Renounce your covenant," the judge said quietly. "Swear loyalty to the king's church, and you will walk out of here alive." The prisoner's voice was barely more than a whisper. "Christ is my king." The executioner's hammer fell. The first wedge drove into the boot with a metallic crack. A muffled groan escaped the prisoner's throat. The second wedge followed, splitting skin and pressing bone against iron. The third broke something deeper, a sharp, splintering sound, like wood snapping in frost. By the fourth, his prayers turned to screams. The sound filled the stone chamber, rebounding from the walls until it seemed the building itself was crying out. Blood trickled down the seams of the boot, dripping onto the floor in slow, rhythmic drops. They paused, waiting for him to break, to beg, to renounce, to curse God and save himself. But his lips only moved in silent prayer. The judge signaled again. The hammer rose. Another wedge was driven in, slower this time, deliberate, the sound of iron crushing flesh and faith together. The witnesses, soldiers, clerks, and priests shifted uneasily. Some looked away. Others forced themselves to watch, telling themselves this was justice. That rebellion must be punished. Yet deep down they all knew this was no court of faith, but of fear. After the eighth wedge, his leg was little more than pulp. The executioner, panting from effort, wiped sweat from his brow. The iron casing glowed faintly where the forge's heat lingered. The smell of burnt flesh mixed with blood and oil still. The man refused to yield. Between gasps of pain, he spoke again. "You may destroy my body, but not my soul." The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Then you will die for your defiance." But death did not come quickly. The torturers, bound by duty, continued, wedge by wedge, hammer strike by hammer strike, until both boots were filled, and the sound of splintering bone had faded into weak, shuddering breaths. The man hung in the chair, limp but still alive. His face was pale, eyes wide open, fixed on something only he could see. Outside, church bells tolled for evening prayer. Above ground, the city carried on, unaware or unwilling to know that below their feet, faith was being tested with iron and fire. In the days that followed, word of the boot spread across Scotland's hidden Covenanter communities. To some, it was proof of the crown's cruelty. To others, a warning to stay silent. But for the faithful, it became a symbol, not of defeat, but of endurance. Each wedge, they said, was a testimony. Each scream, a psalm offered to God. And though many were broken by the torture, some impossibly survived, their legs shattered, their lives forever scarred. They became living witnesses of what men could endure for the sake of conscience. The government's enforcers saw themselves as righteous instruments, purging rebellion in the name of unity. But history would remember them differently, as the hands that wielded the boot, the symbol of Scotland's darkest trial. The iron boots themselves, once instruments of power, would rust in silence after the persecutions faded, yet the memory of what they did, the slow, methodical destruction of human limbs and human will, would never vanish completely. For every hammer strike echoed not just through the dungeons of Edinburgh or Stirling, but through the centuries that followed, a chilling reminder of how belief and brutality can intertwine in the name of order. The man in the boot was only one of many. Some were preachers dragged from secret fields where they held forbidden services. Others were farmers, women, even children, accused of harboring rebels. Their names seldom appeared in records. The government did not preserve their words, only the sound of their breaking bones, written in silence across history's pages. Yet even silence speaks, because when the persecutors thought they had crushed every trace of defiance, the Covenanters' faith rose stronger. In whispers and secret hymns sung under cover of night, and stories passed from father to son, the memory lived on. The boot was meant to destroy the body, but it forged legend instead. By the end of the decade, the crown's grip had begun to loosen, public executions became fewer, and the dungeons quieter. But the shadow of the iron boot remained, a symbol of how far power will go when it feels threatened by conviction. And in that shadow, the echoes of the tortured still seemed to linger, whispering their defiance through time. When the condemned was finally released from the iron casing, the boots were pried apart with iron bars, flesh tore away with the sound of wet fabric ripping. The executioners, hardened men, said nothing as they lifted what remained of him from the chair. His body was carried to a cell, where he would be left to die, his breath faint and irregular. But even then, his lips still formed the words of the Psalms, a hymn half whispered, half broken. Though I walked through the valley of the shadow of death. He did not survive the night, yet his name spread quietly, carried by those who had witnessed his torment and escaped. Around peat fires and in secret barns where families gathered for forbidden worship, his courage became a story told in hushed reverence. Mothers told it to their children to teach them that faith could not be crushed, not by iron, nor by kings. In these hidden corners of Scotland, the legend of the boot grew darker, more vivid. They said that when the wedges were driven, the sound could be heard for miles. That even the executioner his hand shook by the 10th blow. They whispered that one of the soldiers who had helped carry out the punishment went mad within days, haunted by the echo of bone breaking beneath his hammer. But history, stripped of superstition, tells another kind of horror, the cold rationality of law. The torture was not chaos or cruelty born of rage. It was procedure. The boot was sanctioned by courts, signed off by clerks, witnessed by ministers. It was the kingdom's version of justice, deliberate and bureaucratic. The wedges were recorded in numbers, the screams unnoted, for those who enforced it. The pain was necessary, a means of extracting truth, of restoring order, of reminding the population that rebellion had a price. The crown's men called it lawful correction. To the victims, it was simply hell. As the persecutions continued through the 1670s, countless others met the same fate. Some were mutilated before execution, others were left crippled and alive, crawling out of dungeons with shattered legs and shattered faith. In Edinburgh's Parliament close, noblemen discussed loyalty and divine right, while only a few streets away, the smell of blood and burned iron drifted from underground vaults. The contrast was obscene, sermons of mercy above, screams of faith below. By the early 1680s, however, tides began to turn. The Covenanters' cause, once painted as rebellion, became a movement that refused to die at each execution, strengthened its memory. Each martyr's tale carried weight. The boot, the thumbscrew, the rack, they all became symbols of the crown's desperation. And then, when the monarchy itself began to falter, when power shifted again, The torturers' names vanished into obscurity. Only the names of the tortured remained. The iron boots were eventually stored away, gathering dust in vaults that would one day become museums. But for centuries, their presence lingered like a curse. Travelers who came upon the relics in later years described them with unease, blackened, rusted metal with faint traces of bone still wedged in the joints. The sight alone was enough to conjure the sound of the hammer falling. Modern historians who study the Covenanting years often struggle with the same question. How did faith and cruelty coexist so easily? How could men who prayed before meals turn around and crush another's limbs in the name of God and King? The answer lies not in evil, but in obedience. The boot was never about punishment alone. It was about control, the state's reminder that even faith belonged to authority. And in every age since, the lesson repeats itself. Power, once challenged, will always find a tool to silence defiance. The boot may belong to the 17th century, but its spirit lives in every regime that chooses terror over truth. The tools change, the iron replaced by chains, the wedges by words, the hammers by laws. But the purpose remains the same: to break resistance, to make the soul yield before the body does. Yet history also preserves another truth, that not everyone breaks. The Covenanters' defiance, their hymns sung in pain, their prayers whispered through screams, became the foundation of a new kind of strength. Centuries later, Scotland would look back on them not as rebels, but as believers who refused to surrender conscience for comfort. Visitors to Greyfriars Kirkyard still pass the graves of those executed or tortured. Some leave flowers, others coins, and some only pause in silence. They read the old inscriptions, names barely legible, and know they are standing on the soil where faith was tested by fire and iron. The boot, as an object, is gone, but the story remains alive in the cracks of old churches and the faded pages of diaries, in the silence of memorial stones. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of the hammer, not as a sound of cruelty anymore, but as a warning. Because every time justice bends to fear, every time power demands faith instead of earning it, the boot waits to be reborn. History's cruelties may seem distant, but they whisper the same question to every generation. How far will humanity go to force belief? And how much pain will it inflict in the name of righteousness? The answer lies not in the past, but in us. And so, the next time you see an image of that iron casing in a history book, or a museum label describing judicial torture, remember that it was not just a device. It was a message, a language of dominance forged in iron and agony. It crushed bones, yes, but it also revealed something indestructible: the will of those who refuse to yield. History remembers the kings who ordered it, the judges who signed it, but above all, the voices that never recanted. The boot torture stands as a warning from the past, a reminder that when faith meets tyranny, one may bleed, but the other endures.